She was crowned, but if they ever found out who she really was, she would be dead. A Jew on a pagan throne, silence, or execution. What if one of the greatest deliverances in the Bible began with silence? What if God raised someone up to save thousands without anyone ever knowing? Today, we uncover the most overlooked mystery about Esther, and why her story changes everything you thought you knew about courage, purpose, and faith. Because before the deliverance, there was only silence. Dry wind, golden columns, the muffled sound of footsteps, and a young woman bearing a secret hidden beneath veils and perfume. Esther was pulled out of obscurity to become queen of the most powerful empire on earth, but there was one forbidden detail, a secret that could cost her life. She was Jewish. Among the women chosen to please the king, Esther carried something no one could see, a spiritual calling hidden beneath fear, a purpose that had no name yet. How do you accept a crown that demands silence about who you are? With every step inside the palace, her faith had to be hidden, her identity buried. No word could reveal her origin. No gesture could raise suspicion. What once had been a source of pride, her lineage, was now a death sentence. But heaven was not still. Behind the curtain of eternity, a plan was already unfolding. Esther's silence was part of the divine script, and what looked like chance was, in truth, the beginning of a deliverance she could not yet see, because there is a deep biblical mystery. Sometimes salvation begins, not with shouting, but with hearts that know how to stay silent. Esther didn't know it yet, but God was already forging within her a courage that didn't need to be seen to exist, a hidden deliverance, wrapped in silence. As she adapted to the throne's routine, the palace halls whispered of power, vanity, and alliances. But within her, a conflict grew. Her heart beat for a people the king despised, and she could do nothing. Not yet. Because Esther's silence wasn't cowardice. It was obedience. It was discernment. It was timing. The same God who brought her there was teaching her that sometimes the most powerful faith is not the one that demands, but the one that waits. This isn't just the story of a queen. It's the story of a woman placed between the throne and the cross. And when the time comes for her to speak, her voice will shake kingdoms, but until then, the world will believe she's just another pretty face. What no one knows is that God had already written her name in the book of life. The palace was celebrating, but heaven was beginning to grow heavy. As Esther learned how to smile through protocol and stay silent amidst luxury, someone was quietly climbing the steps of power. His name was Haman, a vain, obsessed man, hungry for reverence. But what he sought wasn't respect, it was worship, idolatry dressed up as honor. When Mordecai refused to bow, Haman didn't just see one man, he saw a people, a threat. And with soft words he whispered to the king the cruelest sentence of the empire, a decree of extermination, men, women, children, an entire nation to marked for death. The king listened, and without realizing it, sealed with his ring the genocide of an innocent people. Evil, when cloaked in authority, becomes even more lethal. It doesn't scream. It comes with stamps, seals, and protocol. It wears a crown and kills in silence. The news spread like fire through dry straw. In the streets, mourning, ashes, wailing, an entire people falling to their knees without answers. And inside the palace, silence. Esther didn't know, not yet. But beyond the palace walls, Mordecai wept, tore his clothes, cried out to heaven. Through servants, the queen found out. The words reached her like thorns against skin. And in that moment, something broke. The throne, which once felt like honor, now felt like a prison. The silence that once protected her began to tighten like chains. The spiritual calling that had been sleeping inside Esther began to awaken. Then came Mordecai's message: don't think you'll escape just because you're in the palace. If you remain silent now, deliverance will come from another place. But who knows? Maybe you were made queen for such a time as this. Those words weren't just a warning, they were a revelation. It wasn't about survival, it was about destiny. And maybe it's not just about Esther. Maybe God is positioning you too. Maybe you've been placed in a space where silence is all you have, but even there, God is writing something. If this story is stirring your faith, like it and share it, and comment below. Have you ever felt like you were placed somewhere for a greater purpose? And if you want to keep hearing stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because together we can bring stories like this to hearts that are still silent, just like hers. Esther trembled, but she didn't respond. Not yet. Because sometimes, when God awakens a calling inside someone, the heart must break first, before it answers. She was now queen. She could have stayed hidden, pretended none of it concerned her. But when the pain of her people pierced the palace walls, it pierced her heart too. The silence that once protected her began to suffocate her, and the crown that sparkled on her head began to weigh like stone. That's when Mordecai's words echoed within her, not as advice, but as a mirror. She understood. She wasn't there by chance. The beauty that made her queen was only the path. The calling was the destination. Esther trembled, not because of the crown, but because of the cross, the sacrifice her calling demanded, the possibility of dying for people who didn't even know she was standing in their place. For days, she ate nothing, didn't smile, didn't sleep. She withdrew with her maidservants, locked herself in fasting, 3 days, 3 nights, in silence. Outside, the people did the same, not as a ritual, but as spiritual warfare. This was not a queen before a king, it was an intercessor before God. The divine purpose was being forged in the inner wilderness of her heart. Fear didn't vanish, but now it was submitted to faith. There was born the true courage of silence. She didn't know what would happen, but she knew what she had to do. And when the fast ended, she rose with a decision to go before the king, uninvited, even if it meant death. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of a spiritual war, because the greatest miracle in a story doesn't always come at the end. Sometimes it begins when someone chooses to obey without guarantees. Esther's decision marked an invisible turning point in the story. Heaven answered before she even opened the doors of the royal hall, not with thunder, but with peace. A peace that didn't come from certainty, but from surrender. Esther prepared herself. She put on royal garments. But what she wore inside was stronger than gold or silk. It was purpose. Now she knew who she was, not just a queen, but a prophetic answer for her people's deliverance. The palace was still the same. The corridors, the protocol, the motionless guards, everything appeared unchanged. But within her, nothing was the same. The woman once crowned for her beauty now walked like a lamb, ready for sacrifice. The queen about to face the king was no longer the same quiet young woman. She was someone who had touched heaven through surrender. And when a soul aligns itself with the call of God, it carries more than destiny, it carries deliverance. The day dawned differently at the palace. The air felt heavier, the corridors longer. Esther stepped out from her chambers with steady eyes and lifted shoulders. No announcement, no escort, only silence and footsteps. She crossed the golden marble with the dignity of a queen and the courage of an intercessor. Every step between her and the throne was a direct challenge to the empire, a calculated risk. No one entered that hall uninvited, no man, no woman, not even a queen. But she walked in. Every glance from the guards was an unspoken sentence. The advisors froze. The musicians fell silent. The king, seated on his golden throne, lifted his eyes in surprise. His expression was unreadable. Esther knew one gesture was all it would take. A cold stare. A flick of his hand, and her life would end there, for daring to break protocol, for showing up uncalled, for risking a presence that hadn't been granted. But then, the scepter was raised, slowly, with authority, with mystery. The gesture that could have killed became the gesture that saved. The king extended his golden scepter, and with that, her life was spared. It was the first unexpected deliverance, but Esther didn't mention the decree. She didn't cry out. She didn't reveal the plot. Not yet. She knew that some battles demand more than impulse. They demand strategy and faith. With grace and reverence, Esther simply invited the king and Haman to a banquet. Two invitations, one table, a spiritual plan, disguised as celebration. Haman smiled, puffed up with pride. The queen had summoned him. He thought he was being honored, unaware that the noose around his neck was already being woven. Esther, meanwhile, bore in her eyes the calm of someone who had fasted. Someone in no rush, someone willing to wait one more day to speak, if that's what it took. Between goblets and laughter, the king asked her what she desired. She could have said it then. She could have revealed everything. But something in her spirit whispered, "Not yet." It wasn't fear, it was discernment. There are biblical mysteries that aren't revealed in the first act. There are deliverances that must mature in silence, and there are moments when even salvation must be whispered. She requested another banquet the next day. Haman's eyes gleamed. The king agreed, but heaven already knew. In that 24-hour window, something great would unfold, something beyond the queen's control. Beyond the kings, beyond the enemies. It was God's timing. Haman left the banquet intoxicated with vanity, and as he passed Mordecai standing tall and unmoved, his wounded pride turned into rage. And the wounded pride of a wicked man is like gunpowder beside a flame. Haman ordered a gallows to be built, tall, visible, designed to expose, humiliate, and kill Mordecai. But what he didn't know was that God had already accepted Esther's fast, and that divine purpose is never interrupted by human schemes, sealed decrees, or public threats. The gesture that could have killed had been reversed. The scepter had been raised. The silence was turning into seed. But while the enemy celebrated, thinking himself untouchable, heaven was silently writing his downfall. Haman walked with the arrogance of a man who believed destiny obeyed him. Guest of the queen, master of the gallows, author of the decree. The king had given him limitless authority. To human eyes, he was already untouchable, but to God's eyes, he was one step away from the fall. That night, Mordecai remained silent. There was still no answer, no visible deliverance. And while the righteous fasted, the wicked plotted. The gallows were raised beside Haman's house, a monument to his own pride. Tall enough for all to see, so no one would forget who was in charge. But heaven, though seemingly quiet, began to move. The king couldn't sleep. Something stirred within him, a subtle unrest, as if the Spirit of God were whispering into his thoughts. He ordered the royal chronicles to be brought, and there, hidden among forgotten records, he found Mordecai's name. Years earlier, Mordecai had uncovered a plot to assassinate the king and saved his life, but he had never been honored. That realization unsettled the king, and just as the injustice was brought to light, Haman walked in. The king, without revealing his intent, asked, "What should be done for the man the king desires to honor?" Blinded by ego, Haman thought, "Whom would the king want to honor more than me?" And he suggested it all: royal robes, the king's horse, and a noble leading him through the city proclaiming his glory. The king listened, and then replied, "Do all of that for Mordecai, the Jew." Silence. Haman froze, but he couldn't refuse. He had to carry out every detail of the humiliation. He led the horse through the streets, announcing the virtues of the very man he had planned to hang, because the God who exalts in due season can make the wicked proclaim with their own lips the honor of the righteous. It was the beginning of the turnaround. An unexpected deliverance, not through swords, but through divine irony. The righteous man who sat in the dust was lifted up. The enemy who exalted himself began to fall. Esther watched. She still hadn't spoken, but inside, certainty was growing. God's purpose was unfolding. The fasting had not been in vain. Silent obedience was bearing fruit. Haman returned home disfigured. ashamed, but still clinging to the hope that he could redeem himself at the second banquet. What he didn't know was that God had already written his sentence, not in ink, but in justice. The queen remained poised, but there was fire in her eyes. The time to speak was drawing near. The biblical mystery of patience was reaching its end, and the silence, which had been her weapon until now, would soon give way to truth, because when the enemy exalts himself, God watches, and when the righteous are humiliated, God takes note. The scepter had already been extended. Honor had already been reversed. Now only one thing remained, for the truth to be revealed. But not even Haman, with all his cunning, saw what was about to unfold. He thought he controlled the game, that the gallows were for someone else, that power belonged to him. But heaven had already made another choice. What he didn't know was that there is a time when God seems silent, only to prove that his justice is never rushed. And while Haman's pride built the stage for his own downfall, heaven remained silent for now. The second banquet had arrived. The table was set. The wine masked the tension, the fruit, the spices, the muffled laughter. Everything seemed ordinary, but there was a heaviness in the air, as if even the gold in the goblets feared what was coming. Esther was there, seated, serene, but behind her calm eyes burned fire. The time for silence had fulfilled its purpose. The time for speech had come. The king, captivated by the queen's beauty and wisdom, asked once more, "What is your request, Esther? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." She took a breath. The hall went still, and then the voice that had been held back since the beginning rose up. "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases you, grant me my life and the life of my people." The impact was immediate. The king's eyes widened. The weight of that revelation shook the palace. She was not just a queen, she was part of a people condemned to die, for we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. It was the truth, piercing like a sword. Her once silent courage now became a prophetic voice. The king, consumed by fury and shock, demanded, "Who is he? Where is the man who dared to do such a thing?" Esther pointed, without hesitation, without fear. "This adversary and enemy is Haman." The banquet hall became a courtroom. Haman turned pale. Power slipped from his hands like sand. He tried to explain, begged for mercy, but manipulation had no place anymore. The decree of divine justice had been released. The king, filled with rage, stood and walked out. Haman, in desperation, fell before Esther, pleading, but even that turned against him. When the king returned and saw Haman near the queen, he interpreted it as an offense, a final insult. The silence of God shattered, and the sentence fell. The gallows Haman had built for Mordecai became his own. The instrument of his triumph became his judgment. The unexpected deliverance was fulfilled, not by armies, but by the faithfulness of one woman, and the justice of a God who will not be mocked. As Haman was taken away, the palace realigned, but the decree against the Jews still stood. Esther's salvation was not enough. The danger still lingered over her people. She did not stop. Divine purpose burned within her. She went to the king, fell at his feet, wept, pleaded, not for herself, but for thousands of voices that would never reach the throne. And once again, the scepter was extended. Now, Esther no longer spoke as a subject. She spoke as the intercessor of a generation. She asked that something be done, that the sentence be overturned, that life would triumph over death. The king listened, but the law of the Medes and Persians could not be repealed. Still, a new decree was written, one that allowed the Jews to defend themselves, to fight, to resist. The truth had come to light. The enemy had fallen. But the battle was not over. In heaven, the wheels of deliverance continued to turn, and the spiritual calling of Esther still echoed, because there are times when God waits, times when he watches, but when the moment is right, his voice tears through the heavens. Esther's voice had torn through heaven, but the war was still written on earth. The decree of death could not be erased. Even with Haman hanged, even with the king standing by Esther's side, the old sentence remained. It was law, unchangeable, sealed. That night, entire families prepared to die, unaware that heaven had already rewritten the ending. But God, who does not break man's laws, wrote something higher over them. The king authorized a new edict. Now the Jews had the right to resist, to fight, to strike back with honor. It was the first time the exiled people could lift their eyes with hope. The faith that once fasted in silence now wielded a sword with authority. It was no longer time to hide their faith. It was time to live it boldly. Because when God brings deliverance, it's not only spiritual, it's practical, and it turns victims into victors. On the day marked for destruction, destiny was reversed. Where mourning was expected, there was celebration. Where death loomed, life broke through. God's people stood strong, united and unshaken, and they triumphed. But none of it would have begun without that voice, without that woman, without the purpose hidden in a queen's silence. The story wasn't over yet. But now, fear no longer had dominion. The enemy had no voice, and heaven's decree had spoken louder than any other, and the name of Esther was remembered not for her beauty, but for her obedience. The enemy fell. But what Esther left behind was greater than victory. It was an eternal legacy. She didn't build an army. She didn't raise walls. She didn't write books. But with silent courage, she stood between the decree of death and the plan of life. Her voice didn't just save a people. It revealed a divine purpose woven through pain. The fast unseen by anyone. The decision that nearly cost her life. The obedience that never needed an audience. All of it became legacy. Esther remained in the palace, remained queen, but now everyone knew who she was. They knew her God was the God of Israel. They knew this woman carried an authority that didn't come from the throne, but from heaven. Her story became celebration, became remembrance, became a foundation of faith for generations. And to this day, her name is remembered for what she did when everything seemed impossible. If this story stirred your faith, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That helps us keep spreading the word. Like, share, and comment below. What part of this journey spoke most to your heart? Because when a woman surrenders to her spiritual calling, even in silence, she becomes a vessel for unexpected deliverance. And when someone understands they were placed in a position not to be seen, but to obey, heaven begins to move. The biblical mystery of salvation always flows through those willing to risk everything for love.